People think a fence is just a line in the dirt. They're wrong. Sometimes it's the only thing standing between order and absolute chaos. I learned that lesson at 6:15 on a warm Texas morning when the smell of fresh-cut Bermuda grass drifted across my porch before I even poured my first cup of coffee. The sunrise painted the hills in soft gold, mocking how peaceful everything looked from a distance. Then I glanced toward the north pasture and nearly dropped my coffee mug. Every cedar post my father and I had set by hand was gone. The barbed wire had vanished. Even the heavy steel gate that weighed close to 300 pounds had disappeared as if it had never existed. Beyond the empty property line, white folding chairs stretched across the neighboring meadow in perfect rows. A polished wooden wedding arch stood where my fence had protected the pasture less than 12 hours earlier. Florists hurried between tables covered with ivory linens, while workers adjusted strings of lights hanging from old oak trees. A quartet tested their instruments, and the faint sound of a violin floated across the morning air. Someone had transformed the edge of my ranch into the backdrop for the most expensive wedding I'd ever seen. I walked to the missing fence line, my boots crunching over broken limestone gravel where fresh tire tracks still pressed into the soil. The scent of diesel exhaust lingered in the humid air, mixed with sawdust and expensive perfume drifting from the wedding crew. Whoever removed my fence hadn't bothered to hide what they'd done. They hadn't even tried. Bright orange survey flags lay scattered in the grass like discarded confetti. I bent down and picked up a splinter of cedar, still carrying the familiar smell of fresh wood. My stomach stayed calm, but something inside my head became perfectly still. That's usually when people make the mistake of thinking I'm not angry. Across the meadow, Brenda Whitmore stood with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm, smiling as workers admired the uninterrupted view of rolling Texas pasture behind the ceremony space. She pointed toward my land like she owned every acre in sight, even from 200 yards away. I recognized that confident posture. Brenda had spent 4 years running our HOA like she believed county records were optional suggestions. Today she looked proud of herself. The missing fence had given her daughter the panoramic backdrop she'd wanted for months. What Brenda didn't know was that my family hadn't built that fence to improve the scenery. We built it because nearly 60 Texas Longhorns respected boundaries only when those boundaries actually existed. They followed routine better than clocks, grazing the north pasture every afternoon before drifting toward the creek just beyond where those wedding chairs now sat. Animals don't care about event schedules, luxury decorations, or HOA opinions. They care about open ground. I stood there listening to the breeze move through the live oaks while the distant sound of laughter floated across the property line. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I looked at the empty stretch where my fence had stood for almost 30 years, checked my watch, and quietly realized tomorrow's wedding was about to discover that nature has never recognized HOA authority. My name is Ethan Walker, and I have spent all 38 years of my life on the same stretch of Texas Hill Country where my grandfather first drove cedar posts into stubborn limestone with nothing more than a post driver, sweat, and patience. Around here, people like to say that land remembers who respects it. I never understood what that meant until I inherited the ranch after my father passed away. Every fence line carried a story. Every weathered gate had a reason for standing exactly where it stood. Outsiders saw old barbed wire and rough cedar posts. I saw the invisible system that kept nearly 600 acres working together without a single wasted step. My grandfather used to hand me a pair of leather gloves that were always 2 sizes too big and tell me to walk every fence before breakfast. At 10 years old, I thought it was punishment. At 25, I realized it was education. A loose staple today became a wandering calf tomorrow. A broken post after a storm could turn into thousands of dollars in damaged crops. By the end of the week, on a ranch, problems never stayed small for very long. That lesson echoed through my mind as I stared at the empty property line. The missing fence was not simply missing lumber. It was the backbone of the north pasture. The Longhorns grazing beyond the creek were some of the calmest cattle you could ever find, but calm did not mean predictable. They lived by routine more faithfully than most people I knew. Every afternoon, they followed nearly the same path, drifting toward the higher grass along the ridge before circling back toward the watering pond just before sunset. That route had remained unchanged for almost 15 years because the fence quietly guided them without anyone noticing. Animals trusted consistency. Remove it overnight, and they naturally searched for another direction. I had never needed electric fencing, loud equipment, or cowboys on horseback chasing the herd across open fields. The ranch practically managed itself because every gate, every pasture rotation, and every section of fencing had been designed with patience instead of shortcuts. My father believed that good ranching looked boring from the outside. If everything seemed quiet, that usually meant every detail had been handled before it could become a problem. Standing there that morning, I could almost hear his voice over the soft rustle of live oak leaves. He would have smiled, adjusted the brim of his old straw hat, and reminded me that panic never repaired a fence. Facts did. I slipped my gloves into my back pocket and slowly walked the length of the missing boundary. Fresh tire marks crossed from the neighboring property onto mine. Several broken cedar splinters remained buried in the dirt, and one section of twisted wire still clung to a mesquite branch where the workers had apparently rushed through the job before sunrise. Whoever planned this operation cared far more about finishing before daylight than respecting property lines. Across the meadow, the wedding planners continued arranging white flowers beneath the wooden arch while cameras tested lighting angles against the rolling hills. They admired the uninterrupted landscape stretching behind the ceremony without realizing that the view they loved had existed only because generations of ranchers quietly maintained the boundary they had erased. By mid-morning, I had already learned exactly how the whole thing happened because ranches have something neighborhoods never will. They have people who actually pay attention. My closest neighbor, old Frank Dawson, drove over in his faded pickup with a cloud of limestone dust trailing behind him. He climbed out holding his coffee thermos and shook his head before saying a single word. They started around 11 last night, he told me. 3 trucks, 1 flatbed, 2 work crews. They said the HOA approved everything. Frank had watched flood seasons, droughts, and cattle drives for almost 50 years. It took a lot to surprise him, but even he looked puzzled. They were acting like your property line was a suggestion. That sentence stayed with me. Around noon, I decided it was time for a conversation. The wedding setup had grown even larger. Caterers unloaded polished silver trays while florists arranged white roses beneath the ceremony arch. Portable fans hummed against the rising Texas heat, carrying the scent of smoked brisket and fresh flowers across the meadow. Brenda Whitmore spotted me before I reached the event area. She smiled the same practice smile she always wore during HOA meetings, the one that looked friendly until you noticed it never reached her eyes. "Ethan," she said brightly, "is this not a wonderful improvement?" She extended one arm toward the open landscape behind her as though she had personally created the rolling hills. "The bride deserves an unforgettable backdrop." I looked beyond her shoulder toward the missing fence line. "You removed private property without asking." She laughed softly, almost as if I had misunderstood the situation. "We only removed an unnecessary visual obstruction. It was blocking the photography. Besides, our contractor assured us that old agricultural fencing is not considered a permanent structure in situations like this." I blinked once. "Your contractor is not the county survey office." Her expression barely changed. "Please do not make today about paperwork. We are celebrating family." I could hear generators humming behind the catering tents while workers carried polished wooden chairs into perfect rows. Every few seconds, another golf cart rolled past loaded with decorations. The entire event moved with expensive confidence, the kind that assumes money can smooth over inconvenient details. Brenda stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Tomorrow evening, everything will be finished. We will even have someone reinstall something similar after the ceremony. Honestly, Ethan, you are gaining a much prettier fence at no expense." I almost smiled. She truly believed this was generosity. She had no idea that replacing cedar posts was the smallest problem she had created. I glanced toward the north pasture where the Longhorns grazed quietly beneath the afternoon sun. Their massive curved horns caught flashes of light every time they lifted their heads. They looked peaceful, almost lazy, slowly drifting through the grass exactly as they always did. Brenda noticed me watching them and dismissed the herd with a casual wave of her hand. "Those cows stay over there all the time anyway." I looked back at her. "They stay there because the fence tells them where over there is." She gave a polite little shrug before turning to greet another wedding vendor, ending the conversation as though the matter had already been settled. As I walked back toward my ranch, the breeze carried the distant sound of laughter behind me. In front of me, 60 patient Longhorns continued following the routine they had trusted for years, completely unaware that someone had quietly erased the only boundary guiding tomorrow's path. The afternoon sun settled low over the hills, turning every patch of dry grass into glowing bronze as I drove into town. The air coming through my truck window carried the familiar smell of mesquite and warm dust, but my mind stayed fixed on one question. Had anyone actually given the HOA permission to touch my fence, or had they simply decided nobody would stop them? The county clerk's office sat inside an old limestone building that had been there longer than the neighborhood itself. The place smelled faintly of old paper, coffee, and floor polish. Martha Jenkins looked up from behind the front counter and smiled the way she always had since I was a kid tagging along with my father. "Ethan, what brings you in today?" I explained what happened, keeping my voice steady. She frowned immediately and disappeared into the records room. A few minutes later, she returned carrying several property maps and permit files. Together, we spread them across the counter. Every survey marker matched exactly where my grandfather had placed the original boundary decades earlier. Every easement was documented. Every improvement permit belonged to my ranch. The only thing missing was any application allowing another party to remove or relocate my fencing. Martha slowly shook her head. "There is nothing here. No temporary access request. No construction permit. No right of entry. Whoever did this never came through our office." I thanked her, folded the certified copies into a large envelope, and walked back outside. The late afternoon heat wrapped around me like a heavy blanket as cicadas buzzed from the oak trees lining the courthouse parking lot. I still did not feel angry. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Facts had a way of replacing emotion. Back at the ranch, I found another surprise waiting in my mailbox. An oversized cream-colored envelope with gold lettering rested inside. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened it and unfolded a beautifully printed wedding itinerary. Apparently, every neighboring property owner had received one as a courtesy. The ceremony would begin precisely at 4 o'clock the following afternoon. Cocktail hour followed at 5. Dinner would be served beneath the open sky shortly afterward. I studied the schedule longer than I probably should have. Every event had been planned down to the minute. My Longhorns also followed a schedule down to the minute. They usually left the north pasture around 3:45, gradually wandering toward the greener grass along the ridge before drifting closer to the creek as the afternoon cooled. That path had never changed because the fence quietly guided them away from everything else. I walked out to the edge of the missing boundary once more. A gentle breeze rippled through the waist-high grass, while mockingbirds darted between cedar trees. The herd lifted their heads for a moment, watching me with quiet curiosity before returning to graze. They looked perfectly relaxed because they trusted the ranch to make sense. They had no way of knowing someone had erased one of its oldest rules. Across the meadow, workers continued polishing every detail for tomorrow's celebration. White tablecloths fluttered softly in the wind. Crystal glasses reflected the fading sunlight. Someone tested the outdoor speakers, sending gentle piano music drifting across the open fields. It sounded beautiful. It also sounded temporary. I slipped the county records back into their envelope, locked them inside my truck, and quietly walked the entire missing fence line one last time before sunset. I did not replace a single post. I did not string a single strand of wire. Sometimes the smartest move is not rushing to fix what somebody else intentionally broke. Sometimes patience allows consequences to arrive exactly on schedule. The wedding morning arrived with the kind of clear blue sky that photographers dream about. Not a single cloud drifted over the hills, and the air felt surprisingly cool before the Texas sun climbed high enough to warm the limestone. I was awake before dawn, not because I was worried, but because ranch habits never cared what day appeared on the calendar. I carried a bucket of feed across the barn while the familiar sounds of the ranch slowly came alive around me. Wind moved softly through the live oaks. A pair of meadowlarks called from the fence posts that still remained along the eastern pasture. The Longhorns lifted their heads one by one as they heard my boots crossing the gravel. Their calm never changed. To them, this morning felt exactly like every other morning. That quiet confidence reminded me why my grandfather trusted routine more than luck. After feeding the horses, I walked toward the missing boundary, carrying nothing except a pair of binoculars and my old thermos of black coffee. I settled beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree where I could see both the pasture and the neighboring property without being noticed. Across the meadow, the transformation was remarkable. Luxury SUVs lined the temporary parking area. Valets in pressed white shirts directed arriving guests with polite smiles. Florists made tiny adjustments to centerpieces that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. The scent of fresh flowers mixed with smoked brisket drifting from the catering tents, while soft piano music floated through outdoor speakers. Every detail reflected months of careful planning. Every detail also depended on the assumption that yesterday's decisions would have no consequences today. Around mid-morning, I noticed several wedding planners walking near the open boundary where my fence had once stood. One of them paused for a moment and glanced toward the pasture before continuing with her clipboard. She probably wondered why such a large opening existed, but nobody seemed interested enough to ask. Brenda moved confidently from vendor to vendor, greeting guests with the relaxed smile of someone convinced everything was finally perfect. Every few minutes, she admired the uninterrupted view stretching across my ranch. It was obvious she believed removing the fence had improved the landscape. She never once looked beyond the scenery to consider why that boundary had existed for nearly 3 decades. Shortly before noon, I checked the small weather station mounted beside my equipment shed. A light southern breeze had begun moving steadily across the property, exactly as the forecast predicted. I smiled without realizing it. Wind direction mattered on a working ranch because cattle often preferred grazing into a gentle breeze during warm afternoons. They followed fresh scents carried across open fields almost as naturally as they followed water. The missing fence had quietly changed far more than the view. It had changed the choices available to every animal in the north pasture. I unfolded the certified property records one more time inside my truck, making certain every document remained clean and dry. Then I placed the envelope beside the digital memory cards from my security cameras. Facts were ready. Evidence was ready. The ranch itself was ready. The only people who were not ready were celebrating just beyond the property line, laughing beneath white tents while believing they had complete control over the day. They had planned every photograph, every song, every speech, and every seat assignment with remarkable precision, but they had overlooked one simple truth that every rancher understands. The land always keeps its own schedule, and sooner or later, everyone living beside it learns to respect that fact. By 2:30 in the afternoon, the ranch had settled into the familiar rhythm I had watched since I was a little boy. The heat shimmered above the pasture, turning the distant hills into soft waves of blue and gold, while grasshoppers clicked through the tall grass with every gentle breeze. I leaned against the weathered trunk of the old oak tree, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold, and watched the herd without making a sound. There was no need to encourage them. There was no need to guide them. Longhorns do not follow instructions the way people imagine. They follow habits built over countless ordinary days, and those habits are stronger than any fence once the boundary disappears. The wedding guests had begun arriving in steady waves. Expensive pickup trucks, polished luxury sport utility vehicles, and rented shuttle vans rolled slowly toward the parking area as smiling attendants welcomed everyone with bottled water and cheerful directions. Bright summer dresses moved across the meadow like patches of wildflowers while men adjusted ties beneath wide-brimmed hats that looked as though they had never seen a working ranch before. Laughter drifted across the open field, mixing with soft country music flowing through hidden speakers. Every camera operator searched for the perfect angle, completely unaware that every beautiful panoramic shot included a missing piece they had unknowingly created. At 3 o'clock, the caterers uncovered serving tables, filling the air with the rich smell of smoked brisket, roasted vegetables, fresh baked rolls, and peach cobbler. The breeze carried every scent across the open pasture exactly as the weather station had predicted earlier that morning. Several longhorns paused from grazing and slowly lifted their heads. Their ears twitched almost in unison. It was not excitement. It was curiosity. Animals notice changes long before people do. One large steer with a broad white face took several slow steps toward the open boundary before stopping again. Another followed. Then another. There was no rushing. No panic. No confusion. Just quiet exploration of a route that had never existed before. I glanced at my watch. 3:38. Almost exactly the time they usually began drifting toward the greener grass along the northern ridge. For years, the cedar fence had gently redirected that movement back into the pasture without anyone thinking about it. Today, there was nothing waiting to interrupt the routine except open ground leading toward carefully arranged wedding decorations. Across the meadow, Brenda welcomed arriving relatives with warm hugs and confident smiles. The wedding coordinator spoke calmly into a headset, while photographers positioned family members beneath the flower-covered arch. A violinist practiced the opening notes of the processional, each soft melody floating across the hills with remarkable clarity. Everything appeared perfectly synchronized. I reached into my truck and checked the digital recorder connected to the security cameras one final time. Every file was safely stored. Every timestamp matched the previous morning when workers had removed the fence. The certified county records rested beside the memory cards inside the same envelope. I closed the truck door quietly and returned my attention to the pasture. The first few Longhorns continued walking at their usual relaxed pace, following nothing more than familiar instincts into a landscape that no longer made sense. They were not breaking rules. They were responding to the absence of one. Standing beneath the shade of the oak tree, I finally understood that I was no longer waiting for something to happen. It had already begun, one careful step at a time, exactly the way nature had intended all along. At exactly 3:57, the first notes of the wedding procession drifted across the meadow, soft and elegant against the quiet sounds of the ranch. Guests rose from their seats almost in perfect unison, turning their attention toward the flower-covered aisle while photographers crouched low to capture every carefully planned moment. From where I stood beneath the old oak tree, I could see everything without being part of it. The breeze continued moving from the south, carrying music, conversation, and the unmistakable aroma of barbecue across the open pasture. The Longhorns noticed it too. The white-faced steer that had been leading the herd all afternoon took a few more slow steps toward the opening where the fence had once stood. Another followed close behind, then another. Their pace never changed. Calm, deliberate, completely unhurried. They were simply following the same afternoon routine they had trusted for years, except today the familiar boundary no longer redirected them back toward the ridge. One by one, they crossed the invisible property line without hesitation. Nobody at the ceremony noticed at first. Every eye remained focused on the bride as she appeared beneath a canopy of white flowers, her father smiling proudly beside her. A violin played gently, while dozens of guests lifted their phones to record the walk down the aisle. Then a young boy sitting near the back quietly pointed toward the pasture. His mother glanced over her shoulder for only a second before looking again, longer this time. Several more guests turned. Conversations faded into puzzled whispers. The musicians continued playing, unaware that attention had begun shifting away from the ceremony. The Longhorns kept walking with the same relaxed confidence they showed every afternoon. Their polished horns reflected the late afternoon sunlight, while their heavy hooves pressed softly into the grass. They did not charge. They did not panic. They simply explored the wide opening that someone else had created. The first steer wandered toward a decorative flower arrangement beside the ceremony seating and paused to sniff the unfamiliar display. Another found a patch of freshly watered grass surrounding the reception area that looked far more appealing than the dry pasture behind it. Within moments, the herd spread naturally across the open lawn, weaving quietly between rows of white chairs that guests hurriedly moved aside to protect. A few chairs tipped gently onto the grass as people stepped backward in surprise. Wedding planners rushed from one side of the ceremony to the other, speaking rapidly into their radios while photographers lifted expensive cameras out of the animal's path. Caterers quickly covered serving trays as guests gathered near the parking area, unsure whether to laugh or simply stare in disbelief. The music stopped in the middle of a song, leaving only the sounds of curious conversation, gentle hoofbeats, and the occasional low rumble from the peaceful herd. Brenda stood frozen beside the ceremony arch, her confident smile disappearing as she looked from the cattle to the empty stretch where my fence should have been. For the first time all weekend, she followed the same line of sight that I had studied since sunrise. She finally saw what had been missing all along. Not scenery, not decoration, A boundary. I remained beneath the shade of the oak tree, watching the entire scene unfold with quiet patience. Nature had not interrupted the wedding out of anger. It had simply followed the path that someone else had opened, proving in the most unforgettable way possible that property lines exist for reasons far more important than appearances. The peaceful confusion lasted only a few minutes before reality began replacing celebration. Ranch hands from 2 neighboring properties arrived after hearing the commotion over the radio, and together we calmly guided the Longhorns back toward the pasture using nothing more than quiet voices, steady movements, and a few feed buckets. The herd responded exactly as they always had. Within 20 minutes, they were grazing peacefully again, completely unaware that they had become the center of the most unforgettable wedding story anyone in the county would ever tell. As the last steer crossed back onto my property, a deputy from the county sheriff's office pulled into the gravel entrance followed by another patrol vehicle. Someone had reported loose cattle, and standard procedure required documenting everything. The deputy knew me by name. He also knew my ranch. After making certain every animal was safely contained, he asked the only question that really mattered. Why was the fence missing? I handed him the certified property records from the county clerk's office before saying a single word. Then I removed the memory cards from my truck and played the security footage recorded before sunrise the previous morning. The video clearly showed contractor trucks arriving shortly after 11 o'clock at night. Workers removed every cedar post, every strand of wire, and the heavy steel gate before loading everything onto a flatbed trailer. Timestamps remained visible throughout the recording. License plates were readable. No one had attempted to hide what they were doing because they apparently believed they had permission. The deputy watched the footage twice before looking across the meadow toward Brenda, who stood quietly beside several wedding vendors with an expression I had never seen before. Confidence had been replaced by disbelief. A county property inspector arrived less than an hour later after the deputy requested an official assessment. He walked the boundary markers with a survey map, compared measurements against the county records, and confirmed exactly what I already knew. The fence had stood entirely on my property. No easement allowed anyone to remove it. No permit had ever been issued. No written authorization existed. The inspector documented every missing post, every damaged anchor point, and every section of disturbed ground before adding his signature to the report. By early evening, representatives from the event insurance company had also arrived because several vendors were already asking questions about damaged decorations, delayed service, and unexpected expenses. Their adjuster politely requested copies of every document connected to the incident. I provided the certified surveys, the inspection report, and the complete security footage without adding commentary. Facts speak more clearly than frustration ever can. After reviewing the evidence, the adjuster quietly informed the event coordinator that the removal of private property without authorization would likely become a significant factor in determining liability. The conversation around the reception area changed almost immediately. Nobody argued about cattle anymore. Everyone wanted to know who had approved removing the fence in the first place. The answer grew more uncomfortable with every document that appeared. Brenda remained silent as contractors admitted they had acted on her instructions after being told the fence was an unnecessary obstacle. Standing there beneath the fading Texas sunset, I realized the truth had accomplished something anger never could. Nobody needed dramatic accusations because every piece of evidence fit together like the rails of the fence that should have remained standing all along. The land had simply exposed a decision that paperwork, cameras, and patience would now finish explaining. 3 weeks later, the ranch looked exactly the way it had before anyone decided appearances mattered more than boundaries. New cedar posts stood firmly in the limestone, fresh strands of barbed wire stretched across the north pasture, and the heavy steel gate swung smoothly on reinforced hinges. The only visible difference was that every section had been rebuilt with stronger materials than before, paid for entirely through the insurance settlement and the final legal agreement that followed the county investigation. I never celebrated that outcome because there was nothing enjoyable about watching neighbors learn an expensive lesson. Still, consequences have a way of teaching what polite conversations cannot. The county inspector completed his report within days, confirming every document and every timestamp from the security footage. The contractors admitted they had acted under direct instructions, believing they had authorization to remove the fence. The insurance company declined responsibility for the wedding losses after determining that the chain of events began with the unauthorized removal of private property. Repair costs, damaged decorations, delayed vendor services, and replacement expenses all found their way back to the same decision that had started before sunrise on an ordinary Texas morning. The Homeowners Association held a special meeting the following month that attracted more residents than anyone could remember. This time nobody talked about landscaping standards, mailbox colors, or decorative guidelines. People wanted to understand how something so unnecessary had happened in the first place. Financial records, contractor invoices, and county reports answered those questions more clearly than opinions ever could. Brenda quietly resigned from the board before the meeting ended. No dramatic speeches, no arguments, just a simple acknowledgement that trust, once lost, is much harder to rebuild than a fence. Several weeks after everything settled down, I found an envelope inside my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note from the bride. She apologized for what had happened, explaining that she never knew the ceremony site had been created by removing someone else's property. She wrote that the only photographs her family kept from that day were the ones taken before guests arrived, because those reminded her of what the celebration was actually supposed to represent. I folded the note carefully and placed it inside the same file where I kept the property survey and the inspection report. Not because they belonged together, but because all of them told the complete story. One afternoon, Frank Dawson drove over again with his familiar thermos of coffee and leaned against the new gate, looking across the pasture where the Longhorns grazed peacefully behind the restored fence. He chuckled softly before saying, "Looks like everything is finally back where it belongs." I smiled and watched the herd follow the same afternoon path they had traveled for years, turning naturally along the boundary exactly where they always had before someone decided it was unnecessary. The routine returned as though nothing had ever interrupted it. Standing there beneath the wide Texas sky, I realized the fence had never simply divided two properties. It represented respect, responsibility, and the quiet understanding that every boundary exists because someone learned long ago why it matters. People often think justice arrives with loud victories and dramatic confrontations, but that is rarely how real life works. Sometimes justice arrives through patience, paperwork, honest evidence, and the simple refusal to abandon what is rightfully yours. Out on the ranch, the wind still carried the scent of cedar after a warm afternoon. The Longhorns still wandered peacefully through familiar grass, and every time I closed that rebuilt gate, I remembered one lesson my grandfather understood better than anyone. The strongest boundaries are never built from wire alone. They are built from principles that no homeowner association can ever vote away.